on a brief tour of Immanuel Kant's philosophy. Hi, I'm Dr. Chris L. Firestone, Professor of Philosophy at Trinity International University. I'm also a Kant scholar. I want to invite you to join me on a brief tour of Immanuel Kant's philosophy. Immanuel Kant is arguably considered the most famous philosopher of all time. And yet there seem to be as many interpretations of Kant as there are interpreters of Kant. This course is designed to help you determine the good from the bad interpretations of Kant and to better understand Kant's philosophy as a whole. How am I going to do that? Well, first of all, we're going to follow the contours of Kant's philosophy. We're going to look at the Critique of Pure Reason, where he develops the famous Copernican revolution. We'll then turn to his Critique of Practical Reason, the second phase of his philosophy, where we look at a kind of second revolution that happens in Kant's philosophy, where he discovers freedom and the moral law as the constitutive features of right action. In the third phase of Kant's philosophy, sometimes a forgotten phase, we find Kant wrestling with the notion of whether or not nature and freedom, considered simultaneously, wobble in such a way that reason becomes unstable. He turns to aesthetics and beauty and teleology to help resolve this problem.
Cool song. What is the controller not working? It's not so fucking complicated, oh my god. Just close the game. Okay. Do it again. Really not so complicated. God. Slap. My cat's sleeping. No, no one tired. Oh, somehow the game just doesn't want to seem to be running. Something's blocking. There we go. Defeat.
Finally, we're going to turn to his religious writing. In his much maligned text, Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, I'm going to argue from interpretation of that text as a culminating feature of a good interpretation of Kant's philosophy. Well, I look forward to you joining me on this brief tour of Emmanuel Kant's philosophy, and I hope that when you're done with it, you'll not only better understand Kant's philosophy, but you'll be able to determine good interpretation. Look forward to seeing you in the next few lectures.
Genau, Autoblatt.
I used to view you as a mountain that I can climb at first, but I've only stumbled over diamonds and I no longer fear the worst.
It's philosophy. I call this the instruction manual approach. It's not unlike, let's say, going to a department store and getting 10,000 parts in an instruction manual for how to put a TV together. It's possible. You might need to do some advanced degree, maybe a PhD, and figure out how to get all those pieces to work nicely together. And that's kind of how we grow in our understanding of Kant's philosophy. It certainly seems to be a way that I learned Kant. But occasionally we hear good metaphors, analogies, and so forth. And this more illustrative approach is what these short lectures are going to try to do. That is, give us a good general understanding of Kant's philosophy. What are the do's and don'ts, and how do you separate a good interpretation from a bad interpretation? I'm going to argue over these 6 lectures that Kant's philosophy is a multi-perspectival critique of reason. Now, we could do a detailed analysis of each of those words and start piecing together what I understand Kant's philosophy to be about, but of course that would go against the whole approach that I'm trying to articulate right now. Let's begin by thinking of Kant's philosophy like one might think of a processing plant. That is, reason, which is the very center of the philosophical enterprise for Kant, is something like a processing plant. What comes out of the plant is very much like what you put into the plant. At least that's what epistemologists of the Enlightenment surmised. The empiricists, for example, John Locke, David Hume, and so forth, thought of reason like wet cement. And the hand presses on wet cement like, say, it does on the Hollywood stars, in Hollywood, California. We get the impression. And the impression is something like the hand that gave rise to the impression. And so if you think of reason as a processing plant, the old view was that the processing plant produced the objects of experience, like the camera in front of me and the microphone and the trees out there and the people that we might see and the objects of nature generally. And what went into the processing plant was probably something like those things. We can't be sure exactly what they are, but they must be something like them. That's the old view of reason. But that view showed weaknesses, and Kant actually posits something very different. He asks us to look at the processing plant itself. What contribution does it make to the possibility of experiencing the objects on the sort of business end, if you will, of this processing plant? Prior to Kant, they thought that the objects were very much like the objects that gave rise to them were very much like the ones that came out. But Kant didn't make that assumption. He thought that reason in the processing plant hadn't been fully excavated or understood, and had never really been analyzed. So he purports to do something totally different, something that hadn't yet been done. What are the elements of reason that make the impressions or the ideas that we have possible? What contributions to reason does reason have to our experiences that make those experiences conscious realities for us? We have a unified and continuous flow of experience. When we look around the cosmos and nature, we see one unified whole. It's a continuous flow of experience. It's centered within the human mind. And that unity of that centeredness that we call the self, Kant calls the unity of our perception. Like a complicated philosophical term, but basically it is a term that's trying to understand that focus, that center of human consciousness that makes this whole experiences of nature uniquely mine. And it is, in fact, what makes all the sciences possible. So astronomy, botany, chemistry, and psychology, and geology, they're all, as it were, second-order sciences. They all presuppose the mind's contribution to the very possibility of experience, without which they wouldn't be possible. But because we do have a rational capability to understand our world, all of these sciences are possible. But what makes them possible? What is this prior thing that makes reason or experience possible? This is Kant's question. In the thinkers of the Enlightenment prior to Kant, the rationalists and the empiricists, the two major movements in the Western intellectual tradition at that time, never really analyzed the apparatus of reason that supposedly was impressionable, that made the experiences holistic and uniquely mine. So this is what Kant's philosophy sets out to do at the very beginning. What makes a unified experience possible? What allows us to study the world? What allows us to manipulate the world? What gives the world meaning and purpose? These are some of those major questions of philosophy that we thought we had answers to, but really didn't look at the nature of reason and the very possibility of even having the kinds of experiences that would give rise to answers to these questions. Okay, well that's just a preliminary picture or illustration about what Kant is up to. He's up to analyzing the processing plant of reason, and he thinks that the job of the philosopher is precisely that. When the philosopher starts to employ the findings of philosophy in empirical science, he's actually branching out into other fields. He's not really being a pure philosopher anymore. He might be a philosopher of science, or he might be an ethicist, or he might be an aesthetics professor or philosopher, but not really looking at the contributions of reason per se. And that's what Kant purports to do in his critical philosophy. Now, I've said the term critical philosophy several times already. And it is common knowledge, and probably something that you already know, or at least should know, is that Kant's philosophy has two phases. One is typically termed the pre-critical phase, and the other is termed the critical phase. One is his work prior, let's say, to 1770, and then his work after 1781. Now you think to yourself, 1770 and 1781, what's going on in the middle there? Well, that's oftentimes called his silent decade, because he doesn't really have any published books or works during that time. In his quote-unquote pre-critical phase, he's kind of a traditional rationalist philosopher. You might call him a dogmatic rationalist. He studied Gottfried Leibniz, he studied Christian Wolff, he's in the tradition of René Descartes. He's starting to read some of the empiricists, so we know that he's reading David Hume, because David Hume's work shows up in his writings by 1781. But Kant is kind of a traditional rationalist metaphysician. And we're going to talk about the difference between empiricism and rationalism in the next lecture when we get into the first critique. But the bottom line is that a rationalist is something like an empiricist on steroids. And by that I mean they have a high respect for empirical knowledge, the sciences, and so forth. But they believe, rationalists, that reason has contributions to our experience in the areas of logic in particular, mathematics as well, that have a unique quality about them that is distinctly rational. And so Kant is in this tradition, the continental side, the European side, as opposed to the British more empiricist side. The empiricists look at all knowledge beginning with sensation, and even mathematics and logic are the relations of ideas that emerge after that primordial original experience through the senses. So Kant's a rationalist. He believes in empirical reason. He also believes in logical uses of reason, and so forth. But some problems emerge, we're going to again talk about those in the next lecture, that lead Kant to an insight. And the insight is that there's not just sense perception or just logical knowledge, but that reason might have a more fundamental contribution to our experiences. This is sometimes called the Copernican insight. It's sometimes called the turn to the subject. Kant calls it transcendental philosophy. And that is, just like Nicholas Copernicus, who had inherited the view that the Earth was at the center of the solar system and that it was kind of a passive participant as things revolved around the Earth. Retrograde motion of the planets, of course, upset that view and led to problems that had to be resolved in some way, and Nicholas Copernicus rather famously thought that perhaps we should put the Earth in motion around the Sun, and that would better and more simply handle the retrograde motion of the planets. This is precisely the analogy Kant uses for what his Copernican insight in philosophy is all about. Rather than look at reason as a passive participant in the knowing process, Kant theorizes that maybe it's an active participant. It's passive if all it has is empirical sensation, and if all it has is logical knowledge. But what if it had, Kant theorizes, a priori knowledge that was actively constructing our experiences, kind of like putting the Earth in motion? This is what he calls synthetic a priori knowledge. And this is one of the first key moments in a, someone trying to understand Kant's philosophy for the first time, that the critical Kant and the pre-critical Kant are not really separated by the critical method. You would think that that would be the case. The critical method is about taking two opposed systems of knowledge, or two opposed ideas, and putting them in dialogue or into conflict with one another, and out of them emerges a higher order thesis. That's the critical method. The critical method is taking what's true in both positions and giving a higher order summation or theory that handles or takes into account the best of both positions. That's the critical method. Kant uses the critical method in his pre-critical period. He also employs it in his critical period. There's nothing new there. What is new is the Copernican insight, this revolutionary idea that the subject contributes vital things to our experiences. It's that Copernican insight that turned to the subject, that transcendental component of knowledge he calls synthetic a priori knowledge, that separates the pre-critical from the critical. Hi, I'm Chris Firestone, professor of philosophy and Kant scholar. This is the second lecture in a series of lectures.
Just die, all of them.
Principles and move into Kant's second question, what ought I to do, and the critique of practical reason. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Hi, welcome to this third lecture on the philosophy of Emmanuel Kant. I am Chris Firestone, professor of philosophy and Kant scholar. I'm Chris Firestone, professor of philosophy and scholar of the philosophy of Emmanuel Kant. Welcome to this.
So how do I get the rest?
Hi, I'm Chris Firestone. Hi, I'm Chris Firestone, professor of philosophy and Kant scholar. This is the second lecture in a series of lectures on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In the previous lecture, we had an introduction where I shared some of the general principles for Kant interpretation. And today we're going to focus in on the first real movement of his philosophy in the Critique of Pure Reason. In the Critique of Pure Reason, he establishes what I call the theoretical perspective on human knowledge. Now, just as a brief review of what we've already talked about, Kant's philosophy comes at the end of the modern period, or near the end of the modern period, where there's two major streams of philosophy, empiricism and rationalism. Empiricism, primarily grounded in Britain, and rationalism, which is more on the continent of Europe. And these are two dominant streams of epistemology. From the time of Francis Bacon and René Descartes, epistemology had become first philosophy, and Kant's grapple.
I'm fucking annoyed now. think there was something new now. Maybe it is something new, but it titles it wrong. How would I know it's different? Okay, firstly, I don't need that high quality shit. $720. That's all $720. Okay, the first 360 then.
Hi, welcome to this third lecture on the philosophy of Emmanuel Kant. I am Chris Firestone, professor of philosophy and Kant scholar.
Number 2.
We're going to be talking about the second movement in Kant's critical phase in the critique of practical reason and the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. This is the
3.
second of 4 questions that Kant raises that he thinks reason must have an answer for. The second question is, what ought I to do? In the first critique, the critique of pure reason, he answers the question,
The numbers change. So they are different.